Hey, welcome to episode 154 of Awkwardly Awesome Podcast. At this point, I usually do a little song and dance about my guest and what we're going to be talking about, but the stuff we're talking about today is so amazing. I don't want to spoil it other than to say we're going to talk about how people who are gifted, we sometimes put them up on a pedestal and say, oh, wouldn't it be nice to be so smart, but gifted like any being really gifted like anything in life has its strength, its benefits, its perks, and also its phenomenal challenges. So with that, I probably said too much, but anyway, back in a minute.
Today's guest, Dr. Matt Zakreski.
Well, welcome back. Let me tell you briefly about Dr. Matt Zakreski. Dr. Matt is a high-energy, creative, clinical psychologist who, in my words, works with super smart people all day long. Well, sounds like a really cool job. The Neurodiversity Collective puts it far more eloquently on their website. They say Dr. Matt is best known for his work with gifted individuals as an advocate for using accessible understanding of neurodivergent needs to implement high-level supports. And I'm glad I don't have to explain what that sentence means to you. So, because Dr. Matt is right here, so I'll just bring him on. Welcome, Dr. Matt.
Thanks for having me. I mean, I get introduced a lot. That was without a doubt the best intro I've ever had. That was spectacular.
It's such an honor to have you here, and I almost can't believe you're here because you just found me on LinkedIn, and I asked Dr. Matt, would you like to be on my show? And you say yes, and thank you.
Well, because you're a big deal and your show's a big deal. So, I mean, connecting with you on LinkedIn was me saying, "Gosh, I hope he even looks at my LinkedIn request, let alone says yes, let alone sends me a message." So, there's like a mutual admiration going on here.
Wonderful, wonderful. It's amazing how life works.
For sure.
So I love to take my guests back to early in their lives. If I had known you as a kid and asked Dr. Matt, I guess you were just mad at the point, but ask Matt at age, or maybe you were already a doctor at age 7. I guess I shouldn't assume you would. But if I, right?
So,
What did you say?
I wasn't that gifted. I wasn't a doctor at 7. So,
Nice. So if I had asked Matt as 7, hey, What do you think you want to do when you grow up? What might you have said?
I mean, I think like a lot of kids, I was obsessed with dinosaurs. So I wanted to be an archaeologist by day and Batman by night. Um,
That sounds awesome.
I mean, seriously, right? Who wouldn't want to play with dinosaurs all day and fight the Joker by night? I had to let both of those go eventually. There wasn't a lot of crime, Batman level crime in my small town of Fairhaven, New Jersey. And I didn't have the discipline to look for dinosaur bones. But I was the sort of kid that when I said I want to be an archaeologist or a paleontologist, adults would look at me and go like, "Oh, you want to do dinosaurs?" And I would stare at them and say, "No, I want to be an archaeologist," because they are different things, and you need to understand that. Grown up, I was a very precocious young lad, and and I think a lot of adults didn't get me, and certainly my peers often were a little bit like, why is he using such big words?
At what age was your precociousness, your natural way of being, given a label of gifted?
So I was identified as gifted in second grade. A lot of people tend to be. The American education system has sort of a lot of redundancy built in. And in many ways, second grade is very similar to first grade. So when kids move through those things quickly, then they start expressing, I want to learn more, or getting bored and acting out. And that's when we see a lot of kids get referred for testing. In my case, they gave me a math workbook. They asked me to do pages 1 through 4 in the math workbook, which I did, and then proceeded to do page 5, 6, 7, 10 till I finished the book. And I handed up to my teacher and I said, the book's done. And she flipped through and she said, how did you do this? And I had a real Elle Woods moment from Legally Blonde. It's like, what? Like it's hard? Right? Like the precocious piece. So they did what a lot of adults do to gifted kids, and they sent me to the principal's office because clearly I was up to something. And I sat there and tried to explain to them that, yes, they hadn't taught me the math, but once you understood the math, you could just do more of the math. And, my parents came in. My parents are both clinical psychologists, and they knew a lot of what to look for. They were able to put those behaviors in context. And, I had the IQ test. They identified me as gifted. And this whole crazy journey, which is 30 some odd years in the making now, started then in a small second grade classroom at the Knollwood School in Fairhaven, New Jersey.
That's so interesting. So often in life, when we see something different, something we can't explain, we assume it's dangerous somehow. That there's been some sleight of hand. You got sent to the principal's office for being talented at math.
Yeah.
What?
I mean, the fact is, and there's research on this, regular education teachers tend not to like gifted students. Schools like compliant kids. They like kids who go along to get along. And as a general rule, gifted kids are not those kids, right? They challenge the status quo. They ask questions. They correct teachers, And I remember having a teacher in third grade who kept saying the president was John Q. Adams. I was like, it was John Quincy Adams. And she's like, well, that's what I said. I said, no, you said Q. Well, it's not Ulysses S. Grant because the S was the S, but he was John Quincy Adams. Don't say John Q. Adams. That's not. John Q was a movie with Denzel Washington in the mid aughts, right? That was a different thing. And people like, let it go. I'm like, but they're wrong. And I would like to tell everyone who's listening to us that I'm no longer that guy, or I'm only that guy up here in my brain. I don't say it as much as I did when I was 9.
But as a kid, you would maybe get kind of offended by adults saying what seemed wrong to you. You're like, the adults not supposed to say something wrong.
Right. I mean, you have a responsibility to teach me and teach me accurate things. And if you don't know it, then empower me to learn it myself. And I end up saying this in my speaking and consulting part of my job. I say this to teachers and administrators all over the country. It's like, if you don't know the answer, practice intellectual humility and tell your students, I don't know what that answer is. Let's look it up together, right? Thankfully, we've all got the internet and our phones in our pockets, and we can look up most things pretty quickly. But that's going to endear you to all of your students, but particularly your gifted students, because they're going to say to you, okay, this is a person who knows what they know and knows what they don't know. That's a person I can get behind, right? It's the people who are like, I would, this is the answer and I won't think about it in any other way. That's how you lose your students.
And as you say that, I'm starting to think that this is one of the most crucial skills to teach all kids, to realize what they don't know, and for adults to role model that. Because if we raise kids who think they need to know everything and pretend when they don't, like, our kids won't be explorers. They won't actually seek out the information they need to grow, they need to expand, that they need to problem solve.
I mean, absolutely. And this is why the ideas of perfectionism and failure are so rampant in the gifted community, is because a lot of us don't develop those skills properly until much later in life. And there's actually an academic term for it. It's called the performance cliff. So if you imagine, right, you're this smart and school gets harder. Sooner or later, school gets harder than you are smart. Now, for most kids, this happens between 7th and 10th grade, right? And for some kids, it happens later. Some kids, it happens earlier, but just we'll use 7th to 10th grade. So let's say for me, it was 8th grade. So in 8th grade, I was trying to do the same stuff I had always done, just cruise along, not study, do my homework in 3 minutes, finish every test in about 2 minutes. I wasn't being challenged. I was just regurgitating. And so when the responsibilities and engagement changed, I didn't change along with it because I had never practiced those skills, the skills of resiliency and hard work and asking for help. I mean, I have 2 younger sisters, and, my sisters, who are both very bright, but they don't, they didn't have the same gifted identity I do. They had to work hard. They had to study and make guides and do flashcards. I didn't make my first flashcard until high school. So now you're trying to build these skills in an environment where the stakes are very, very high. I mean, imagine if you've never written a really strong paper, and the first time you have to write a really strong paper is your college acceptance essay. You go from never having to do it to the very high stakes. And of course, the anxiety makes that harder. So we need to push meaningful engagement and challenge to kids earlier, so they develop those soft skills that allow them to navigate those moments and not fall apart on the back end of it.
So I can imagine a grade school teacher watching and saying, "Hey, Dr. Matt, that all makes sense, but how? I have kids who barely master or who barely grasp anything from what I teach, and I have kids in the middle, and then you want me to challenge my gifted students to how do I do all that in one classroom when there's behaviors and kids are bored? How?
Well, and that's the question. And I love that you asked that, because it's a real problem. And the last thing I want to do is ask America's teachers to do any more than they're already doing, because goodness,
They're kind of busy at the moment.
a little bit, right? And so this is where the ideas come in, where we actually are going to bridge the gap by serving your gifted kids, by serving the whole classroom with best practices. So the best practices in gifted education are actually just the best practices in education, full stop. So the things you do to serve your gifted kids will actually serve everybody in the classroom, regardless where they are on the IQ or learning spectrum, which is super cool, right? So if we do differentiation, right? Differentiation is meeting kids where they are. So I wouldn't, you have a very successful podcast, Jason. I like your podcast. I'm not going to start with you at here's how to start a podcast. You press the button and it records and you're going to say things, because you don't need those skills. You have mastered that.
And if you try teaching me that, I'm going to be very bored and possibly act out because I'm so bored.
Absolutely, right? When we teach people things that are too easy for them, they disengage. And when they disengage, they tend to act out, like you said. But then if I say, okay, Jason, you need to have 6 million followers by the end of the month, right? And it is today, September 29th. Any way you can get up to 6 million followers in the next day?
And I'd be like, Dr. Matt, I don't want to do a podcast anymore because it would sound overwhelming.
Because it is overwhelming, right? So when it's too easy, we disengage. When it's too hard, we can't engage. So it's all about level setting. So if I said, hey, you have a really successful podcast, here are 2 simple tricks that you can go from good to great with your podcast, and I told you what those were, that's meeting you where we are. We call this the leading edge of learning. It's where at the right level to teach them at. So if a kid is showing you that they know all their letters, instead of spending the next 3 months teaching them how to do the letters, let them start writing simple words, simple sentences, see what they can do until they can't do it. And then once they show you they can't do it, that's where you teach them. And you can do that in groups and clusters across the whole classroom, because kids are going to be in more or less groupable clusters. So you're teaching every kid at their own leading edge of learning. So the kids who are working on letters, work on letters. The kids who are working on words, work on words. The kids who are working on sentences, work on sentences. And if you've got, Julia over in the corner there who's already writing Wind in the Willows, well, then you let her go write Wind in the Willows, because goodness me, why would we try to stop her?
So differentiation is one of the best practices. What are some other ones?
We also want to do interest-based learning, right? And we've decided that certain things are going to be taught and certain things aren't going to be taught, and that's complicated. But you can engage any person through their levels of interest in a way that arbitrarily picking something else is not going to work for them. So one way we could think about this, right, is I worked with a kid a couple of years ago who was obsessed with the Titanic. I mean, he knew chapter and verse, right? He knew where the steel was made that was in the boilers. Like that level of specificity, right? And I'm like, I've seen the movie a couple of times. I think I own the VHS. And he's what we call a twice exceptional learner. He's gifted level IQ and he was autistic. So he had both of those things going on, right? So he was a challenging kid to teach because he had super high highs and super low lows, and he was sort of a challenging kid to work with. And we were getting ready for the 4th grade curriculum. Everybody was gritting their teeth because they knew it was going to be hard. And we sort of organically came up with this idea that he does better when he can talk about the things that he likes. So we said, well, what if we really embraced that? What if we made his 4th grade year about Titanic? And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, okay, in history class, we're talking about the history of the Titanic. Like, why was it made? Why was it in Liverpool? Why was it going to New York? How did boats get bigger? Like, what's the history of boats, right? And ocean liners and steam engines. It organically led to all these other concepts. And then in art class, we're painting pictures of the Titanic. We're painting pictures of icebergs. And then in English class, we're writing stories. And in math class, we were doing math problems that weren't like, if Jim has 3 apples and Tony has 4 apples, how many apples do they have together? You change that question to Jim has 3 souvenir Titanic plates and Tony has 4 souvenir Titanic plates. How many souvenir Titanic plates do they have?
It's the same math, but suddenly he likes it and he cares about it.
Right. And everybody has stuff they care about and everybody has stuff they don't. And I can hear the old timers going like, well, life isn't always going to be about the things you like. Obviously. But if we're trying to lower the threshold for kids to learn and school is hard enough as it is, doesn't it make logical sense to lower that threshold? Not the rigor. We're not holding kids to lower standards, but we're lowering the threshold of engagement. Because if you sit in any classroom in America right now and you start rattling on about the deficit or the interest rates, the eyes are going to glaze over. But that same kid, you're like, hey, do you see what Mr. Beast did on TikTok? The kid's like, yes, I saw what Mr. Beast did on TikTok. And now you've got them. It's not manipulative. It's realistic, and there's a reason that you and I connected to talk about the stuff you and I talk about because we have a lot professionally in common. I'm probably never going to be on a financial advice podcast because that's not interesting to me. And I'm not
Dr. Matt, I probably won't be on a financial advice podcast.
Darn, right? But we can do podcasts in this space that are empowering and enjoyable and enlightening because we're playing to our interests and strengths. So we're doing differentiation and we're leading with student interest. Now, without changing fundamentally how education works, we're changing how it's delivered. And when we change how it's delivered, kids engage.
So going back to you as a kid, do you have a story of a teacher who really kindly differentiated for you and catered to your interests?
I was lucky that I had a lot of teachers who I love to draw. I draw cartoons. So a lot of teachers let me do a lot of projects based on drawing cartoons. I remember we had to do a journal in 6th grade and we were supposed to write, I think it was 20 pages in our journal. And I had filled every other page with drawings, but my teacher accepted it because she's like, this is work. You did work, right? But the letter of the law, I didn't meet the assignment, but she understood that drawing was a part of my creative output process. And since I was drawing cartoons, there were speech bubbles in there. So it's not like I wasn't writing words at all. But really, the first time I can remember that was I was accepted to the Center for Talented Youth, CTY summer camp, and they run camps all over the country. And over the summer, you spend 3 weeks living on a college campus, taking level courses. So we're hitting that differentiation because we're at the highest level. And then we're doing a vital piece where there's no homework. Now, this is an entirely separate podcast, but homework doesn't work, right? It's not been shown to increase retention or get higher grades. It stresses kids and families out. I would like very much to pick homework up and throw it in the ocean if I could.
That sounds like it's a different podcast, but that sounds like a really great podcast.
Yeah. Someday we'll be on that one. But I distinctly remember being around these other kids being taught by these teachers who were holding me to a very high standard and giving me the tools to be successful there, and thinking, I want to feel like this all the time. Like, I
Mm.
want to be challenged and engaged and motivated and be around other kids who think and learn like I do. Like, I, they have to drag me out of there like a fingernail marks, right? Like, no, don't, you know. So
What grade were you in when you first went to this camp?
it was the summer. Yeah, it was the summer after 6th grade. So I was 12, I would think. Yeah, that tracks 12. And I attended CTY 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade. You can only do 5 years. So I did all 5 years. And then I went back and I was an RA at the camp that summer. And now I'm pretty involved with the CTY alumni network because I made giftedness my profession, right? That's what I do. So, I mean, the amazing team over at CTY, and it's based out of Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. We've collaborated on a few things, and I think we've got some other cool stuff in the hopper, because this is, this whole gifted idea, right, is that gifted education is special education, right? And any special population needs specific and tailored and bespoke support. And there's nothing wrong or elitist of that. It's equitable. We're giving people what they need. Some kids need extra help getting their math facts. Some kids need to move through multiplication to algebra. Why would we live in a society where we're not giving people what they need, even if that thing is not what we're used to giving them?
That's a huge deal for anybody like to be where I am today. I needed speech therapy early in life, and if they had just said we don't give speech therapy because it's not normal,
No.
not something normal kids need, I would have been very inhibited in my career hugely.
Right. Well, and that's just it. I mean, when we give people what they need, we remove any artificial sense of what they can and can't do. I mean, I've worked closely with a gentleman who is a pretty successful Special Olympics athlete, who's told when he was a kid he couldn't walk. But when he does Special Olympics, he has his special blades, right? And he's been very successful in those competitions, right? So you go from somebody who was told he couldn't walk to now he's setting course records 20 years later. I mean, it makes me emotional, right? Because, like, Jason, you have a unique and powerful voice, and you've created a space where people feel heard and seen because they see themselves in you as someone who's overcome so many challenges. But to your point, if somebody had said to you way back when, oh, well, we don't do speech, or why would we give you speech? You're never going to do anything. You're never going to run a podcast. You would have stopped trying, and you wouldn't have had the skills to succeed even if you wanted to try. Right? I mean, you are proof positive, my friend, that best practices not only work, but they can change the world.
Feels good to hear. Thank you. So we talked about kind of the educational piece of the gifted experience and how that and the parts of that are working and the parts where we have room for expansion as a society. But what about the social aspects? There's unfortunately so many stereotypes of gifted kids, nerds, and it just goes on and on. How were the social aspects growing up like like you were in third grade correcting teachers. How did that play out with your classmates?
Well, I was more drawn to the other nerdy, atypical kids, and it's funny because I certainly wasn't the best athlete by any stretch, but I was competent. I could play sports and I was reasonably okay at them, and I wasn't good at baseball. I was really bad at baseball, but soccer, basketball, hockey was pretty solid at.
Nice.
Yeah, so it's not like I couldn't do them. But when you think about the things that are valued at young ages, right? It's knowing the cool things and playing sports, and I wasn't that person. So I always sort of felt on the outside looking in. But it created in me sort of a social chameleon ability, because when you don't fit in, you can run away from the problem or run towards the problem. So I started thinking, like, what binds them? What do they connect over? Can I connect with them over the things that matter to them? And so throughout most of my life, I've had a real talent for finding a way to get people to talk about things that they care about and are interested in them. And this gets back to that idea of interest-based learning, right? Get people to talk about things they care about, they'll learn more. It's also the foundation of good psychology, right? The problems that your client brings to the table are their problems, and the solutions have to be things that they're comfortable with and make sense to them. I tell people all the time, it's not my job to turn you into me, right? I don't want you to have my skill set, my personality. I'm not trying to make an army of clones here, right? I want to give you social skills or emotional skills that are authentic to the person you want to be. Right. So if you're someone who wants to get up and lead the conga line at a wedding, then by all means, we'll get you there. And if you're someone who's more comfortable having a cup of coffee with a dear friend for 3 hours, then we'll get you there. Right. But that's what that kind of authentic practice looks like. And the challenge of doing that when you're little is that you're aware of what you are and you're aware of what you're not. So the word we use for this is masking, right? So I masked a lot. Growing up in the mid 90s, right? Professional wrestling was very big. Everybody loved professional wrestling. And I just didn't, it's not my thing, right? It's just not my thing. I can't explain it any better than that. And I wouldn't begrudge anybody else from loving it. But it's the sort of thing that, Triple H, The Undertaker, The Rock, and it doesn't connect with me. But when you went to sleepovers or birthday parties, that's what people wanted to watch and talk about and do. And I spent a lot of time in a lot of kids' basements pretending to be really interested about John Cena wasn't around yet, but Rey Mysterio doing something. And I'd be like, But, it's the sort of thing you got to go along to get along. But I craved those experiences that I was having at Gifted Summer Camp, where you could have a 3-hour conversation about deep Star Wars canon, right? Because that was what I wanted to talk about. I was super into comic books, and the mid 90s comic books weren't cool yet, right? So it was like this sort of dark secret. But then, someone else like, hey, would you like to talk about some classic Silver Surfer? And I'm like, more than you could possibly imagine. Right. So, we all mask to an extent, but when masking gets in the way of growing in an authentic direction, it becomes problematic. Right. So at some point, you've got to sort of let go of the masks and give yourself permission to be the person you actually want to be.
So what would you, knowing what you know now, what would you tell the kid you were who spent so much time at sleepovers watching something he really wasn't interested in and kind of detested.
I mean, you can find things to connect with for anybody, and honestly, if you're into professional wrestling, aren't comic books like just a half step away from professional wrestling? Big costumes, overly muscled people, good guys, bad guys, giant fight sequences. They're not that different, really, right? So if you like professional wrestling, maybe I can interest you in this Batman comic book, and then maybe start those balls rolling, right? The other thing is that everybody has value, right? Because my brain works one way, I'm drawn to certain types of people who communicate in certain ways and talk about certain things. But there is giftedness everywhere, right? We don't all just sit around in some salon discussing, the problem in the socio-political environment in the Balkans. I don't know anybody who talks like that. But I can talk about climate change, or I can talk about educational reform, or I can talk about the problems with recycling, and those are things that we can get passionate about. And my colleagues who talk about like breakthroughs in coding technology, a thing that doesn't interest me, go with God, my child, right? It's like it's cool. It just doesn't scratch my itch, right? So I'm not better than anybody else. I might be able to figure some stuff out faster, but the part about giftedness that I wish I understood as a kid, that I understand now, is that being gifted is so much more than being smart, right? Giftedness has a seat at the table for neurodivergence, right? It's literally a gift. The gifted brain is literally a different brain. And that manifests in things like being very emotionally intense, having a strong sense of justice. Gifted people don't let things go. Like I said before, John Quincy Adams, not John Q. Adams. That apparently that matters. I was always jumping into fights on the playground and breaking things up and playing peacekeeper. I was very, very diplomatic young man. And it also comes with some social differences, right? Not necessarily liking the things your peers like. And I was always chasing around other adults to talk to them about stuff because I was really interested in what the adults had to say, and they would listen to me, right? And those were parts of being gifted that I didn't understand as a kid. And I really wish I did, because I would have helped me understand some fundamental pieces of myself and my own development. One of the things we know for personal psychology is that in the absence of information, our brain creates its own narrative. So without knowing that there are social and emotional differences that come with being gifted, I just assume I was broken. I was screwed up, and no one knew to tell me different. So it becomes a secret shame that a lot of neurodivergent people carry, because they just assume their differences are some personality structure flaw rather than a natural outgrowth of just a different brain. And the more we embrace that, the better we all do.
So much here. How about giftedness? There's a lot of talk about high sensitivity. Is there any link between giftedness and being highly sensitive?
Oh, goodness, yes. So highly sensitive, we can talk about it both in the emotional piece, but also in the sensory piece, right? I didn't know that sensory needs are a part of being neurodivergent until I started researching it in grad school. So, I was in my 30s. Kind of wish I had known that earlier.
It's a crucial piece.
Crucial piece, right? If you can imagine, right? I don't know if you've ever opened like a package and styrofoam peanuts.
Yeah.
Right? The noise they make when they rub together, I'm telling you, you might as well hit me with a cattle prod. I'm like, I can't. Like, there's something about that sound that makes my brain short circuit. And other people don't experience that. But if anybody out there in podcast land knows what I'm talking about, they're nodding vigorously right now. That's a function of the parietal lobe, this is the top part of your brain, being overly connected to other parts of your brain. So the sensory input you're getting from your environment, whether it's from your ears, your eyes, your nose, or there's tactile sense or taste, sorry, I forgot that one, means that you are experiencing those things in hyperdrive, right? So it's a more intense experience that moves faster through your body. So, and then you have to deal with the fact that nobody else is responding the way you are. Like some people might go like, oh, I don't really like the taste of garlic. Whereas you're like looking like Dracula, like, whoa, no, not garlic. Right? It's not fun. And people are like, you're just doing that for attention. Or is it that my brain is treating that as a red line thing rather than just I just don't like that very much.
How about giftedness and creativity?
So creativity is a big part of being gifted. And, this is one of the talks I love giving. I actually gave this to a bunch of college students back in the spring. And it was such a fun talk because the coolest thing about creativity is that it can't be wrong. So you can be creative in many different directions and many different styles. My creativity tends to involve words and art, right? I can draw a cartoon about something, or I can express myself through a PowerPoint presentation that's creative, and people are like, oh, that's a really cool idea. Whereas, my father-in-law, who's a brilliant coder, would express that something equally cool through writing something in Erlang, which is a computer coding language. I only know that because I listen to him. And that's creative, right? So you get kids, especially kids who are more STEM kids, go, I'm not creative. I'm like, the heck you're not. You built a website in 15 minutes this weekend that runs an emulator. I mean, that's really cool. We associate creativity with the arts, but creativity exists anywhere. And we need to make more room for creativity in school. We need to make more room for creativity at work, right? I mean, aren't we both more happy doing something like a podcast, which is more creative in nature, a little bit more free form than like filling out forms?
Yeah.
We were not put on this earth to do homework sheets or fill out forms. Like we are at our best when we're using our brains to solve problems and think outside the box. That's when people do their best.
What if someone's watching this and like Dr. Matt, but you don't know me? I'm not creative. I'm just not. What would you say to that?
Well, I'd say that you're almost certainly more creative than you think you are. And also, just because you are creative or you have creativity doesn't mean that you even necessarily want to use it, right? Some people are very happy going through the business of the day-to-day punch the button, right? And that's the thing. If that's what you need, by all means, right? But there's a concept in creativity called little c creativity. Little c creativity is there's mini c, little c, big C, and I forget what the last one is. I'll have to look that up. But the idea is that little c creativity is the day-to-day stuff we do every day to get through the day. Like right now, my laptop that I'm recording this podcast on is sitting on top of a very large book because my wife is using the desk I usually use to put my computer on for podcasts to do some art. So I have to use a little creativity to raise this up so you're not looking at the underside of my chin, because let's be honest, that's not a good look for anybody, right? So no, I'm not going to put that in the Louvre. I'm not going to apply for a MacArthur Genius Grant because I put my laptop on a book. I have to solve that problem. Did you get your kids to school this morning? Are you wearing clothes? Did you navigate getting to work on time or make that lunch date? Or did you find time to listen to this podcast? Because if you did, you used a certain amount of creativity, right? Because creativity involves solving problems. And we are beset by hundreds of thousands of problems every day, right?
And it keeps expanding.
Exactly, because the more we do it, the better we get at it. Have you ever seen the statistic that teachers make more decisions in a day than brain surgeons?
No, wow.
Right? And it's a hard thing to quantify, but I believe it's true. And I have known many brain surgeons and many teachers, and I can tell you they're both brilliant. But the idea here is that there's not a single classroom in America where everyone is sitting quietly and the teacher's reading a book for 35 minutes, and then everybody stands up, puts their stuff away, gets up, and leaves.
That's in some movie, probably.
Right. And just like there isn't a brain surgery that is completely by the book. Oh, we opened up the brain, we did the thing, we cut the thing out, we sewed it back up. Like, that's not how life works. So we are constantly readjusting our approach, our responses. We're adapting in real time. And it's actually so built into our brains that we don't even think we're doing it most of the time. Right? This podcast has taken us in many different directions, and we're just rolling with those punches, showing creativity and cognitive flexibility that, I've been on podcasts where people are like, I'm going to ask you these 10 questions. I would like for them to have these answers. I'm like, this isn't a podcast, this is an interview. And that's real different than at least the podcasts I enjoy listening to.
How about, gosh, there's so much, so just giving a little space and honor to each thing, but how about giftedness and anxiety, giftedness and stress, giftedness and worry?
Oh, yeah. It's a lot, and you can think of our brains as what if machines.
Oh my gosh.
Right? What if this happens? What if this happens? What if this doesn't happen? And fundamentally,
my brain has been a what if machine on so many occasions.
Yeah. And the funny thing about anxiety is that it's meant to help us, right? Anxiety is evolutionary, right? Because when we were cavemen walking through the jungle and we heard a rustle in the bushes, and the cavemen who thought, what if that's a saber-toothed tiger, ran and lived, whereas the people were like, what if that's a squirrel that got eaten? But the problem is we have this hair trigger anxiety system that's meant to keep us alive in life and death situations. And now it's applied to, did I get an email from my boss? The stakes are lower, but our system can't tell the difference. And the more your brain can conceptualize, the more your brain can think, there is a distinct relationship between that and anxiety, because it's a what if machine, right? I can think of what ifs that would, twirl my own toes. And the more you can think of, the more problematic your anxiety can be. And if you're out there thinking like, well, I'm not sure if that applies to me, what are you more anxious about? The things you know a lot about, or the things you don't know a lot about? I would bet you a steak dinner, I think you're more anxious about the stuff that you know a lot more about, because you know what you know and you know what you don't know. You know what the limitations are of that knowledge, versus it's like, it's like I can change a tire. I'm not anxious about changing a tire. But if you ask me to like fix my engine, I would scream and run down the street. I don't have that knowledge set. I'm anxious about being a father because I know a lot about raising children because I'm a clinical psychologist, but I'm also so aware of all the stuff I don't know. And that terrifies me. That keeps me up at night.
So on my show, I talk about the power of doing our imperfect best. Oh, first I have to ask you. So you gave a presentation in Europe last year, right?
Yes.
What was the title of the presentation?
So I'm lucky enough to give a lot of presentations. People seem to want to hear what I have to say, and that's no false modesty. It's just I'm very lucky, and it's very cool. So let's see. This week I was down in Dallas and I gave a talk about the power of hope. And then last year I gave a keynote in Europe and we talked about how failure is fundamental. It's those are important topics, and you're trying to take things that everybody deals with every day and make them accessible so we can turn those lessons to something tangible that we can use to make our lives better.
So wasn't the title something about the power of failure?
Yeah, that's failure is fundamental. It's all about the power of failure and how it helps us. We actually learn more from failure than we do from success.
So we hear that, but then it's so easy to immediately go back to I don't want to fail at whatever cost. I just want to avoid failure. How do we get beyond always hating failure?
Well, the cool thing about failure is that it's going to happen to us whether we want it to or not. Right? Has this been a perfect podcast, Jason?
Nope.
Nope. It's been pretty good, but it's not been perfect. Right? And we are forced to deal with failure. And from a basic psychological perspective, we cannot change what happens to us, but we can change how we respond to it. So, like, think about it this way, right? Imagine you're in a haunted house. We're almost near Halloween, right? I'm terrified of clowns. Jason, what are you most scared of?
Actual ghosts.
Ghosts, yeah. So if we went to a haunted house together, I know there's going to be a clown room because there's always a clown room in the haunted house. And there's going to be a ghost room because it's Halloween, there's going to be ghosts. Now, we can't change that we're there at the haunted house, and we can't change the fact that those things are scary. But when you know the scary thing is likely to happen, it changes your relationship to it, right? So if you say, instead of trying to live my life where I never make any mistakes ever and I'm perfect in all things all the time, which is exhausting and not even possible in the first place, then you change your relationship to that thing in a way that's like, I don't have to like it, but I can accept it. We pay taxes every year. I don't know anybody who likes paying their taxes, but every year we sort of grumble and we fill out our forms by April 15th and then we send them in, and it's not that big a deal. But the year that I was most stressed about paying taxes was the first year I had to pay taxes. I was like, wait, what is this? This is awful. I don't like that at all. So it's the sort of thing, like, you don't have to like failure, but since it's inevitable, you might as well see what you can try and learn from it. Growing up, my dad always told me you either win or you learn. In my life, I've learned a lot more than I've won. And I would bet, Jason, you feel the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And the funny thing, getting back to the idea of creativity, well, really, it's creativity and anxiety, because creativity and anxiety are counterindicated. The more anxious you are, the harder it is to be creative. Right?
Yeah, for sure.
And if we're anxious about failing, it's harder to use creative solutions to solve the problem. Right? I do all the cooking for my family. So I find, like, if I come in, like, I'm going to cook meatballs tonight, and I open the counter and we don't have any breadcrumbs, I like crash to a halt. I'm like, what am I going to do? Clearly, there are no other meals that exist, right? It's like, there's not meatballs. I don't know. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? But it's like, well, I have the ground meat and I have the tomatoes and I have all the other things. Maybe I'll make a meat sauce. Maybe I'll make hamburgers. Maybe I'll make literally anything else, right? So it's coming in with an idea of flexibility, right? Rather than it's got to be one way. And it's hard to train yourself to do that, right? Because we like to succeed. Succeeding feels a lot better than failing. But every time we do something, we get a little better at it and we learn something about how to do it better next time.
Along with that, what about it can become a habit, but what about starting to set things out? Set things you want to do out, because it's easier to think of them perfectly in your mind than actually do the thing and deal with the mess of the failures.
Well, the cool thing about that is that you actually deal with the mess of failures a lot more often than you think you do. When you wake up in the morning, your shirt isn't exactly where you wanted it to be. You have to go get the things you need to do to get ready in the morning. You come downstairs and you have to, maybe you're making yourself a cup of coffee and you realize that, you didn't put enough water in the coffee maker last night. So you got to fill up, like you're doing things multiple times, hundreds of times a day. They're about those tiny little failures, the stuff that we've got to overcome, those mini C creativity moments we talked about. So fun fact is that we actually are pretty good at dealing with the unexpected. It's one of the best things about being human. But when the stakes raise and you fail a math test, or you asked that person out and they said no, or you get into a fender bender on the way to work, those are bigger failures and they're going to have a bigger emotional response. That's appropriate. That makes sense. But that also means that the lessons are going to be bigger too. You got into a fender bender on the way to work. Maybe it's time you actually kept your phone in your pocket as opposed to sort of checking the ESPN scores as you drive. That's a hard lesson, but it's a good one. I've gotten a lot better at that since I had children. I realized I have people that matter most to me in the universe in the back seat. That text message can wait 15 minutes, right?
Yeah.
And it's that sort of thing. Like when you fail, you can think of it like a fraction, right? The number on top of that fraction, the numerator is always going to be 1. Always. The bottom number, the denominator, that's what we can change. So if you try and juggle. Can you juggle? I can't juggle, right?
No.
Right. So if you try to juggle, your failure rate's going to be 1 out of 1 for the first many times you try to juggle. But then you start again, and then your failure rate's 1 out of 3. Okay, that's not so bad. Then you keep practicing. It's 1 out of 6, 1 out of 12, 1 out of 19, 1 out of 24. And then you add in another ball. So you go from 3 balls to 4 balls. And then your failure rate crashes. It goes back down to 1 out of 1. But then you're going to find your growth curve's a lot faster for the second time because you've mastered some of the basic skills. You're not winning so much as you're learning. And that's the thing. It's like everything we've done to get to this point, from your first podcast to first time you drove a car, first time you asked somebody out, first time you tied your shoe, first time you fried an egg, whatever those things are, we sucked at many things when we started. And you forget.
We sucked at many things when we started.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, I listen to myself give talks. I listen to myself on podcasts. I can tell you the very first podcast I was ever on, because I spent most of the podcast like sort of shouting. I was talking very loudly because I was anxious. Now I'm a lot more relaxed. Because
I'm very glad you got past that phase. Thanks so much.
You're welcome, Jason.
So last question. I talk about in my business the power of doing our imperfect best. And what it means to me is we envision the best we want for our lives and the best we want to contribute. And and when mistakes come up, imperfections, instead of using those as reasons to stop and say no to ourselves, we learn from them and move forward. What does doing your imperfect best mean to you, Dr. Matt?
That's a fabulous question. Being my imperfect best, being my imperfect best to me means that the things that matter most to me don't have an upper limit. There's no perfect. There's no perfect father. There's no perfect therapist. There's no perfect podcast guest. There's no perfect keynote speaker. Failure is baked into all of those things.
Mhm.
But instead of running from that or hiding from it or fighting it, I embrace it. And I wish I hadn't coughed when I was starting this little anecdote, but I did. And all I can tell you is like, well, I wish it didn't happen, but I'm not going to let it ruin the rest of this podcast. That's the choice I can make. Right. And so it really is the sort of thing. There are things in life that you can do well. You can cook a perfect steak. You can clean your car till it's showroom ready. You can mow your lawn. There are things that have achievable limits of perfection. But the things that matter most to us, teaching, being a friend, being a parent, being a son, being a romantic partner, being a podcast host, there's no perfect. It doesn't exist. So you embrace that it doesn't exist. It allows you to just grow and grow and grow and grow forever because you're not chasing that moving finish line, right? You're just saying, oh, well, where's my journey going to take me? And I'll get better at this every time I do it.
That's one amazing definition, my friend. Thank you. Lastly, if people want to find out more, how can they connect with you?
Well, I am pretty easily findable. Like we said, I am on LinkedIn. That's where we connected. We've built a pretty fun Facebook group, facebook.com/Dr. Matt Zakreski. Psychology humor, gifted humor, neurodivergence humor, and some solid stuff there too. And then, if you were interested in learning more about the therapy or speaking or training that I do, my practice's website is the neurodiversitycollective.com. If you punch my name into Google, Dr. Matt Zakreski, it's the second thing that comes up. Yay analytics, I guess.
Yay having a unique last name.
I'm telling you, right? I'm sure there's a lot more Jason Freemans than there are Matt Zakreskis.
There are a lot more Jay.
But there's only one Awkwardly Awesome podcast.
Yeah, that's true.
See, that can be your new bumper, right? There's only one Awkwardly Awesome podcast. It's my announcer voice. So, but yeah, I mean, I'm very, I have a big online presence because I love connecting with people. I'm blessed that I love what I do. So, if what I had to say was interesting to you, please shoot me a message and we can connect further.
Thank you. It's been fascinating having you on the show. Thanks, Dr. Matt.
Well, it's been a pleasure. And I'm so glad that you and I connected and can take this journey together. And I hope we get to do it again sometime.
Thank you so much. I do too. Oh, wow. That wasn't, I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. And it's only the tip of the iceberg. We talked about fascinating thing, but there's so much more in all of this. I encourage you to reach out to Dr. Matt if you're inspired. Find him on social media. Or else, like, there's Google, there's books. If you hear something that lit you up and you want to know more about it, find out more about it. I need that message for me too. Life is so fast. Let's just keep exploring it. We're wishing you a great day. Please tune in next Wednesday for another awkwardly awesome podcast with another amazing guest. Until then, you are amazing. Thanks for being you.